good afternoon. First, we'll have this very nice session now. It's an honor to have David Rubenstein here. But just to some logistics issue. We'll have lunch will be served after this session. So we'll have more or less 45 minutes of informal and I expect intelligent talk. And certainly from David's side, it will be intelligent. I think it will be very interesting for you being in front of one of these legends of the financial industry of our times. So after this, we'll go for informal lunch right after this room. Right, Martha? Yes? Yes? Okay. So, David, if you want, join me. Again, thank you. Okay. Well,
I think it's working. Okay.
Yeah. Well, David founded Carlyle in 1987 with two partners, and Carlyle became one of the largest and most preeminent financial entities here in U.S. Amazing asset manager now with alternative asset manager now with more than $300 billion under management. One of the global most admired private equity brands. And David probably will tell us a lot of interesting things about this history. But David is not only a financier, he's also very well-known and admired in a number of philanthropic initiatives. And I participate with David in one of the boards that is part. In reality, he's my boss there because he's the chairman of CFR Advisory Board. And I have the pleasure of seeing how brilliant David is. And privilege for all of us to have you here, my friend.
I am honored to be here, and I wish my market capitalization was as high as yours. So you're a lot more brilliant than I am.
Thank you very much. Maybe, David, if you could start telling us a little bit, what changed in private equity industry when you joined it? You left government,
Right.
Founded Carlyle, was the early days of private equity. How was the industry there, and how is the industry today?
In 1987, when I started Carlyle, there were roughly 200 private equity firms in the entire world. Today, there are close to 9,000. It's obviously been a growth industry. In the early days of private equity, people may forget this, but the phrase private equity wasn't invented then. It was called leveraged buyouts. And then the word leverage became odious, so they changed it to management buyouts. But the word buyout became odious, so they came up with the phrase private equity, which also is odious to some people. So we're looking for a better name. In those days, people may have a hard time remembering this, but in the famous RJR deal done by KKR in 1989, it was 5% equity, 95% debt. And that was not atypical. In fact, in those days, it was typically 1 to 5% equity and 95 to 99% debt. So those deals were highly leveraged. Also, the investors were relatively a small set of people, high net worth individuals from the United States, largely, and U.S. public pension funds. There weren't really large sovereign wealth funds, global pension funds. Most of the investors were really from the United States. There were some high net worth individuals from around the world, but generally it was more of a United States related business, and to some extent Western Europe. And the rates of return, because of the high leverage, high growth rates, and the low prices people paid, 6 or 7 times cash flow, the rates of return were in the 20% range. So if you went with a good fund and went in a good deal and a co-investment, you might get a 25% or 30% net annualized rate of return. So today, moving forward, when people see other people making money, what do? Do they run away from that? No, they run into it. So more people run into the business to invest, more people join the business to be a person who also gets some of the profits from doing the investing. So today, the rates of return that people can realistically expect is probably in the mid-teens, 13, 14, 15%, depending on the type of private equity. Private equity today means more than just buyouts. It can mean real estate, distressed debt, venture capital, growth capital, many different types of private equity. It's more a global business than it used to be. While the United States is still the dominant private equity place where people put money and where the money comes from, it's much more global than it used to be, with the emerging markets like Brazil becoming much more important than it used to be. And also, I'd say finally that it used to be that private equity was criticized a lot by people for not worrying about ESG concerns or not doing the appropriate things in terms of paying taxes or so forth. Today, that's less a concern. We don't tend to be called locusts as much, and many people around the world want private equity dollars to come into their country because they think this will probably make companies more attractive, more efficient, and ultimately pay more taxes. So it's a much better industry than it used to be. It's not as complicated as many people on the outside would think. It's basically the same basic business of getting people to commit capital to you, finding some time to invest it. Today, people add more value than they used to do. They used to maybe depend on leverage or macroeconomic growth. Today, people spend much more time adding value to companies, putting operational improvements in. So I think it's a good industry to go into. My 3 children are in private equity. So I have no struggling artists. I have no filmmakers, no people that I have to worry about how many years I'm going to have to support them. So they all have MBAs in private equity. So maybe my best accomplishment is getting my kids to go into private equity, which I say is the highest calling of mankind.
I'm trying to make my children investment bankers, right? I already failed the first one. He's a psychologist. She's a psychologist. David, what changed now? Carlyle is a public company, and your main competitors are also public companies. What changed in the private equity industry or inside Carlyle after being a public company?
The business model, I came up with a business model in the late 80s, early 90s. Nobody's given me a royalty for it, but nobody's patted me on the back for it. At the time, people made fun of me. And the basic model was simply this, and the innovation was this. In the old days of private equity, you got a fund, and your fund said you have to spend, if you have the money, 100% of your time on this fund. So therefore, all the funds, KKR, Forsman Little, and so forth, they only had one business. They had a buyout business. I decided I was going to change something. Now, whenever you're changing something, you're either breaking a rule, you're going to get somebody to be upset with you. But I decided what I would change was this. I said to my partners, you guys are better investors than me. You have more finance experience. You manage this $100 billion fund that I just helped raise. Make sure it does well. I'm going to create a family of funds the way Fidelity had a family of funds in the mutual fund business. So we'll have not only this buyout fund, and I won't spend 100% of my time on it, I will go out and help create a growth capital fund, a venture fund, a real estate fund, and then therefore I'll have a family of funds, and if people liked us in one area, let's say buyouts, they might give us a chance in another area. That's just what, let's say, the mutual funds had done. They used their brand name to do what's called a line extension. And then I said, secondly, I'm going to globalize it. I'm not going to depend on the United States. I'm going to go to Europe, Asia, Latin America, Middle East, so forth. And that's what we did. Now, others have done it. In some cases, you might say they've done it better than we have. So what's happened today is of the 9,000 private equity firms in the world, more or less, there are a limited number, mostly a half a dozen or so, that are based in the United States that are doing the same thing that Carlyle did years ago, in some cases doing it more successfully than we are in some respects. And they are global. They have many different lines of business. They have enormous amounts of money under management, and they're publicly traded. And publicly traded, being a publicly traded company, as you know, is not as easy as you would like it to be. And the reason it's complicated for private equity firms is this. When you're in private equity, what you're supposed to do is you get a fee on committed capital from your investors. This was an innovation that private equity people came up with in the late 70s and early 80s. They convinced investors to give them a fee on committed capital. The money wasn't being invested. They got a fee on committed capital, and they convinced people to give them 20% of the profits if there were profits. So in the business that we've historically been in and private equity is historically in, you get a fee on committed capital. It's supposed to pay your rent and your salaries, and then the upside is the 20%. And if you get a 3 times multiple on invested capital and a 30% IRR, people are going to like you. You're going to get more and more money. When you go public, the people that buy public shares are different than the people that invest in your funds. The people that buy public shares, they don't care about your rate of return. They just care about what your earnings are going to be next quarter and maybe 2 quarters down the road and maybe next year. And the only way
if they think long term, right?
I'm sorry?
If they think long term.
If they think that long term. And so how do you figure out what your earnings are going to be next time? Is it how much money you're going to make from selling a company in a year or two? No. They take the fee that you get on committed capital, more or less, and any other fees that you can pretty much certainly get, and then you subtract your costs, and whatever is left is called fee-related earnings. And you get a very high multiple on that. You can get a 15 to 18 multiple on it, but you get a 2 or 3 multiple on your carried interest income that you might get from investing well. So it's a kind of strange situation where when you're spending all your time with your investors in your funds saying how high your rates of return are, when you meet with investors in the publicly traded company shares, they don't care about your rates of return. They just care about how much more assets you're going to have under management and how much fee income you're going to have above your costs. So it's a different phenomenon. The last point I make about this is that all the private equity firms that went public initially went public as a partnership, because there's no doubt that income in private equity is favorably taxed. And so what we all did is we said we won't pay a corporate tax, we'll just pass along the income to the investors and they'll pay whatever their tax is in a partnership form. But it turns out that if you're in a partnership form, you aren't able to be in an index. And 80% of all the stocks traded on the NASDAQ or New York Stock Exchange are in indexes. So if you're not in an index, you can't really get people to buy your stock because people just want to buy things that are in indexes. So all of the large firms, including Carlyle, have either or in the process of converting to being a corporate form, and that theoretically should have more people buy the stock, and the stock should go up. So we'll see what happens.
Good. And David, you are a lawyer by background. You live in Washington. Carlyle became probably, or certainly, the biggest, most sophisticated, and certainly most respected financial company in Washington. How is to run such a leading global company in Washington, outside the financial center, close to the political world? What changed? What is better? What is worse?
Well, there was a famous senator in the United States who once said, when you're getting kicked out of town, get out in front and pretend you're leading a parade. Now, what does that mean? It means take advantage of the situation you find yourself in. I found myself in Washington, D.C. with no investment banking experience. I wasn't a very good lawyer. The government person for whom I worked, Jimmy Carter, had lost the re-election in 1980. So I had to leave the White House. I didn't really get trained as well as to be a lawyer as I should have. I only practiced law a few years in New York, so I wasn't a great lawyer. I knew that already. So I decided to do something different. And as you all know, if you're entrepreneurs, when you do something different, everybody tells you you're making a mistake, and particularly your mother will say, you don't know anything about this. And my mother said, keep your bar license, because when you fail at Carlyle, you can go back and practice law. And so I kept my license. I still have my law license, because you never know if Carlyle might make it. I have to go back and practice law. But I took a chance, and entrepreneurs always are people who take a chance when people tell them you can't do something. Bill Gates' parents told him, maybe this is not going to work. Steve Jobs' friends said, what, a personal computer? Jeff Bezos' friends said, you're going to sell things over the what? The internet, what is that? So people who take chances, sometimes they fail, and 99.9% of all new companies fail. The 0.1%, those people that succeed are the ones that you often read about later on. So I took a chance because I wasn't good at what I was doing, and I also didn't want to spend the rest of my life practicing law. And so I happened to live in Washington. Had I moved to New York, people would have laughed because I didn't have an investment banking background. But to take advantage of the situation, I said, here's what I'll do. I'll say that we understand how government affects business better than the guys in New York, because they don't really know government as well as we do. And to make that clear, I would bring into my firm Frank Carlucci, a former Secretary of Defense and ambassador to Portugal, Jim Baker, former Secretary of State, Dick Darman, former head of OMB, John Major, former Prime Minister, and another person named George Herbert Walker Bush, who was former President of the United States. So for a while, people were saying Carlyle was really a political firm. we really weren't really that, but just in those days, if I invited any of you to have lunch with me, you would say, what better thing can you do? Who wanted to have lunch with me? But I said, come and have lunch with Jim Baker. You would say, of course I'll have lunch with Baker. And after Baker finishes lunch, before you finish the dessert, I would get up and say how great Carlyle was. So that technique worked, and people also thought we actually knew a lot more about Washington than maybe we did. And so it worked. Now, it backfired and on us in a while, because after George W. Bush was elected president, and I got in trouble for that. He had been on one of our boards, and he resigned to get ready to run for governor, and later he ran for president. And somebody said to me at the time, did you ever think that George W. Bush, when he was on one of your corporate boards, would be president of the United States? And I said, well, at the time, if you asked me to name 100 million Americans who might be president of the United States and qualified to be, he wouldn't have been in that 100 million. Unfortunately, I thought it was an off-the-record kind of thing, like I hope this is off the record. And so somebody picked it up and went to the New York Times. The front page of the New York Times the week before the election in 2000, it said, David Rubenstein, who used to employ George W. Bush, thinks that there are 100 million Americans more qualified to be president than him. Oh, God. So I saw him after the election he won. I said, Governor, I'm very upset that this off-the-record, tongue-in-cheek kind of thing got out. It was in the New York Times on the front page a couple of days before the election. He said, I don't read the New York Times. What did it say? I said, well, never mind. So George Herbert Walker Bush said, my son is president of the United States. I'm not going to be in business anymore. But after 2 months, he got bored with that. He came back to our firm. So what happened is when the Iraq War happened, we began to be blamed for it. And people said, well, you guys are part of the Bush administration. I said, no, we're Carlyle, we're an investment firm. But we got beat up for it. So ultimately, one of the saddest things I had to do is I had to ask the individuals I mentioned to be retired from the firm, and I brought Lou Gerstner in as chairman of our firm to kind of give us a more business image. But even today, people think we understand government maybe more than we do, but because we're based in Washington, we do have pretty good access to what's going on in government. And I have known all the presidents of the United States reasonably well since the time I left the White House, and I can tell you about the current president if you'd like.
We'll talk soon about scenario, but let's move to more serious things. Now that you became a TV star, and David runs this amazing David Rubenstein show, and I strongly recommend seeing the interviews. And how has been this experience of pop star? The real career. Now we'll talk about the real business.
Well, unfortunately, there's no carried interest in interviewing. So I have to stay doing private equity. What actually happened is, like many things in life, many of you may have skills that you didn't know you had, or that people didn't think you had, and you have hobbies or sports or various professional activities you're very good at, but maybe you didn't know you were good at it. And I didn't really think I had a career in interviewing. What happened was this. At Carlyle, we used to bring very famous people into Carlyle conferences, former presidents of the United States, secretaries of state, and we pay them $200,000, $300,000, and they would get up and give a speech, and it was boring. And the people were looking at their watches, when is the speech going to be over? So I said, geez, maybe I could interview them and maybe inject a little humorous question here or there. And I said to people in the future, look, you don't have to give a speech, prepare a speech, I'll interview you. And they said, the same fee? I said, yes, same fee. They said, okay. Oh, same fee? They get the same fee. Okay. So I would interview them, and I would make Ben Bernanke look funny. I would, so it was good. And so, okay, so I figured I can do that okay. And then what happened was Vernon Jordan, a prominent Washington businessman lawyer, said, David, I want you to succeed me as the president of the Economic Club of Washington. And I said, well, what is the Economic Club of Washington? I never even heard of it. And he said, it's 100 business people. You get a speaker once a quarter. You get them come in. They make a speech, a CEO. Then questions come from the audience in the cards. You read the cards, and that's it. I said, okay. So I started doing that, and I realized that business people were as bad as speakers as the government people I had been hiring. And then when the cards came up from the members with the questions, they were terrible too. So I would pretend I was reading a question from the audience, but I was making it up as I went along. And so I was maybe humorous. So people were laughing. So I said, okay, I'm going to junk that format and I'll just interview people. Now I've done about 150 of them over the years. And somebody from Bloomberg saw it and said, why don't you do this on Bloomberg? And I said, okay, but I'm not, I don't have that much time to do it. They said, no, we'll work around your schedule. And I said, well, what are you going to call the show? and they said, we're going to call it the David Rubenstein Show. And I said, geez, I don't know if a long Jewish name is going to work on a TV show. They said, well, this is Bloomberg. We think it's okay. So, I started the show, and to my amazement, Bloomberg is not CBS or NBC or ABC. It's not that well known, but it's basically a TV program or network that is given free to cable networks around the world. So they don't really charge for it, and therefore it has like 350 million viewers around the world. And if you go to a hotel room and you're flipping through, you'll see a Bloomberg. Sometimes you might see them in airports or whatever. And it's actually a lot of people, to my surprise, watch it. And unfortunately for me, they rebroadcast it 20 times a week. So it's hard to miss it sometimes if you're on Bloomberg. And so people actually like it, and I've done a fair number of them, and presidents of the United States and famous cultural figures and business people. And people ask me all the time, how do you do this with no notes? Now, you don't have notes here, and you're using my technique. My theory is that if you have notes in front of you, you will inevitably look down. And as soon as you look down, you've lost the eye contact with a person. It looks like an interview, not a conversation. So I do a lot of research. I write the questions down. I kind of memorize them more or less, and it's not that hard to memorize something for a couple hours. And that's how I do it. And I try to make it humorous and try to bring people, talk about themselves and what made them tick. And people are interested in how other people became successful, what were their tricks, and that's kind of what I have been doing. So it's worked out okay.
Has been working.
I'm sorry?
Has been working.
So far, it's working, but I've been doing this. I do some other interviews, and I'll tell you about one other thing. I have a book coming out. I'm not promoting it yet, but it's called The American Story. And what happened is, a few years ago, I thought members of Congress do not understand American history enough, and they're passing the laws. So I went to the Library of Congress, and I said, I'll tell you what, I'll sponsor a dinner where we invite members of Congress to come once a month. I'll get a great American historian, Doris Kearns Goodwin, David McCullough, Robert Caro, and I will bring them in. We'll have a reception for members, ask the Democrats and Republicans to actually talk to each other. We'll bring them down, we'll have a dinner for them, and I will interview one of these great historians. And so we've been doing that now for 6 years. I do one a month. I did one last night. And a book is coming out with some of the best interviews. And if you're interested in American history, it'd be interesting. I don't know if it's appealing to this audience as much, but I'll just mention one interview that is in the book. It's not a historian, but it's a man who's the Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts. And he's been the Chief Justice for, about 14 years now. And I've gotten to know him because I'm the chairman of the Smithsonian, which is a series of 19 museums we have in Washington. And he is involved in the Smithsonian as well. So when I thought members of Congress don't know him that well, I'll interview him. So I interviewed him in front of members of Congress, and I said to him, did you always want to be Chief Justice of the United States? He said, no, I had no interest in that. Did you ever want to be a Justice of the United States on the court of the Supreme Court? No. Did you want to be any type of judge? No. Did you want to be a lawyer? No. Well, what did you want to be when you were growing up? He said, I only wanted to be a historian. That's all I cared about, being a historian. So my father said, well, John, there's no money in being a historian. You'll write books nobody will read. You'll spend all your time in the library. And he said, I don't care. I just want to be a historian. I love American history. So he said, okay. So he went off to Harvard, and he majored in history. So one day he's coming back from a spring break. He lands at Boston Airport, Logan Airport, gets off, gets in the cab, and says, can you take me to Harvard? And the cab driver said, well, okay. Are you a student there? Yes. What are you majoring in? I'm majoring in history. And the cab driver said, well, when I was a student at Harvard, that's what I majored in also. So, so John Roberts thought that maybe he should find a different career anyway. So.
That's a very good one. But what's your take on this huge vision fund and as an experienced private equity investor, these valuations, this new innovation, how are you seeing this?
Look, I'm jealous that somebody can raise a $100 billion fund. I can't raise a $100 billion fund, and if he can raise another $100 billion fund, I'm even more jealous. It's too early to tell how it's going to do. He's obviously made some good investments, some still are unproven, so he's clearly a very talented person in many ways. Remember, when I interviewed him, he pointed out to me that was worth, at one point he may have been the third richest person in the world, but then the tech bubble burst of 1999 and 2000 happened, he lost 99% of his net worth. So he's come back before. Very smart guy. Time will tell whether it works out, but clearly he's made some really good investments.
Volatility is a little bit high, but anyway. David, moving to a little bit of the economic scenario, the political scenario, you made a speech recently about the U.S. and the recession risks. How you are seeing that here?
The United States has had a recession on average every 7 years since World War II. So we're like every 7 years we have a recession. We haven't had a recession since June of 2009. That's when we ended the last recession, the Great Recession. And for those who don't know this, the United States government doesn't say we're in or out of recession. They don't want to be blamed for it. So it's actually outsourced to a think tank in Cambridge, Massachusetts, called the Bureau of Economic Research. They said we got out in June of 2009. Now we're 10 years into a growth cycle. So everybody is kind of looking over their shoulder saying, okay, how much longer can this happen? And this good fortune happen. So people are worried when the recession is going to occur and what's going to make it happen. So people have been saying, well, maybe we have too much debt in the United States, but that hasn't scared the market so much. Maybe people are saying we're paying too much for companies and buyout. People are paying too high valuation, but that doesn't seem to be causing a recession. And people are saying that maybe the political situation in the United States is dysfunctional, but that doesn't seem to be causing recession. So at the moment, it's not clear that a recession is imminent. We are not growing at 4% or 3%. We're probably growing around 2%, which for an economy our size is not heroic, but it's not terrible. I'd say there are always possibilities of a recession happening. An exogenous event you can't predict. Suppose all the oil fields in Saudi Arabia had been put offline, or some other military event that we can't anticipate that could maybe cause a recession. Right now, I don't see anything in the imminent future, and I think the most likely thing that people are worried about as potentially causing a recession in the United States, a deal with China or a no deal with China. I think that by the end of the year, we will have a China trade agreement. It won't be a perfect agreement, but it will calm the markets. And with Feds lowering interest rates, as I think they will again before the end of this year, I think between now and the time of the presidential election, we're unlikely to have a recession. And our presidents in our country are obsessed with running for re-election in recessions because they don't get re-elected. Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, George Herbert Walker Bush ran when we had a recession. They all lost. So President Trump is very interested in making certain we don't have a recession, at least before the election. And I think he's got a pretty good chance of avoiding a recession.
David, you mentioned the trading discussions with China. And it's clear that most part of U.S. what Trump claims are reasonable claims. And everybody agrees with that, and including China, that has what to offer. Since China has what to offer, and Trump can claim victory, what is missing to conclude a deal, and why it's getting so complicated?
Well, let me explain. It's one thing to say to a small country, I'm going to put tariffs on if you don't do what I want or you don't give me the trade agreement I want, and maybe you can beat up a smaller country. You can't beat up China. China is the second biggest economy in the world. Maybe some would say they're really the biggest if you measure by purchase price parity. They have 1.4 billion people. They've been around for 5,000 years. It's not easy to just beat up on China. So when the tariffs began, the Chinese weren't sure what was going on, but they finally realized that the president was serious about trying to get a deal, and they have negotiated a deal back and forth. I think the deal has three parts. Part number one is that China would buy more U.S. products, maybe between $1.4 trillion and $2 trillion over a 6-year period. I think that will probably get done. The second part is the Chinese will open up their markets to more American companies selling things there, and better intellectual property protection and better patent protection. I think that will probably get done. The third part is the part they've stumbled on. China has a program called China 2025. And under that program, they're going to use government resources and other resources in the corporate world to be a leader in the world in computer design, semiconductor production, artificial intelligence, 5G technology, and robotics. Well, some people in the American government say we don't want China to be that dominant or that strong in these areas. We want to be that strong, and they're using government resources. That's a little unfair. So we've tried to get China to back off on that in the negotiations. China has said we're not going to do that. So I think that is something that could lead to the deal not getting done. But on the other hand, the first two parts of the deal that I mentioned, I think they could get done, and the President Trump could say, look, I got 2/3 of what I wanted, and the other things I'll get if I'm reelected, and I'll get it later. And so I think that they can massage it and say it's a pretty good deal, not a perfect deal, pretty good. You just have to be careful not to say, I got everything I wanted, the Chinese got taken to the cleaners, because the Chinese can't live with that. So they'll have to agree on a way to phrase it so the Chinese can say to their constituents, we got a good deal as well. But I think a deal will get done by the end of the year, because I think the President recognizes if you let it linger too long, it could push us into a recession.
Do you think he's absolutely clear about that?
I am 100% confident that he understands that, 100% confident.
Yeah. And David, you're talking about the long, now 10 years of positive markets, and everybody is thinking about what could be a trigger for eventually a more relevant correction in markets. Next year we have elections, and eventually there will be again populist candidates on the Democrat side. Of course, on the Republican, it's clear Trump is there, the economic policy is there, his personality is there, everything's priced. Do you see the possibility of real surprise of someone more populist, kind of Elizabeth Warren, or Bernie Sanders, probably a little bit distant of that, but someone like Warren competing on a 50-50 basis with Trump could be a trigger for a market correction, and how feasible this risk is?
If you go back the last 10 presidential elections and say, this person is going to be president a year in advance, you would be wrong almost every time a year in advance. You wouldn't have predicted a year in advance that Barack Obama would have beaten Hillary Clinton. You wouldn't have predicted that Jimmy Carter would have been president. You wouldn't have predicted George W. Bush would be president. You wouldn't have predicted that Bill Clinton would have been president. And you certainly wouldn't have predicted that Donald Trump would be president. So a year is a long time in advance of these events. Secondly, we tend to reelect presidents unless there's a recession. There's no recession, a president usually gets reelected. Third, the Democrats have 25 candidates, but they really have 3 candidates. There are only 3 candidates. I think it's extremely unlikely that anybody but 3 people can be the nominee. They are Bernie Sanders, who's 78 years old, will be 79 if inaugurated. He is a Democratic socialist, and while he's very appealing to many people in the party, I don't think the party is likely to nominate him. Second is Joe Biden, who is 77 years old. And he is a former vice president for 8 years. I know him reasonably well, and I think people worry about his age and is he too old to be president. They don't worry about Bernie Sanders because they know he's not going to be president. And so Joe Biden has sometimes he says things he wishes he hadn't said, but in the end, people seem to like him. There's a pretty good chance of being the nominee. But the other person is Elizabeth Warren, who has not run for president before, not as well known, but she's got young people who are clearly excited about her. She draws big crowds. So if Joe Biden were the nominee, I think it would be a much closer election, assuming he doesn't say things that are inappropriate or before now in the nomination. It's too early to say, but the good thing about this is that I am now 70 years old, and I feel like a teenager compared to the people running for president on the Democratic side or on the Republican side. President Trump is 2073. So, when you turn 70, some of you may have reached that age yet by now. You don't know whether you think you're really in good shape or not. When I was in the White House and Jimmy Carter was running for re-election, I was 31, and I said, we're running against Ronald Reagan. He's 70. He barely can't get out of bed in the morning at that old. How can anybody think he could possibly be president? Well, of course, he got elected. And Elizabeth Warren is 70, is a little bit more older than me. She's a little older than me. She's about 70. And as I mentioned, the other ages. I was disappointed the other day to read that Jack Ma retired at 55. And he said, I have to retire now because I have to get stuff done before I'm 70. The implication being when he's 70, he couldn't get anything done. But I would say, to answer your question, I think it's too early to predict. If I had to bet today, it'll be between Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden. It's too early to say. But I think both of them will have a tough time against Donald Trump if the economy is in reasonably good shape. In our country, by the way, there are 50 states, but there are only really 8 for presidential elections because we know how every state's going to go except for about 8. So if any of you were an American citizen and you were the Democratic nominee, no matter what you say or do, you're going to win California. And if any of you are an American citizen and you're the Republican nominee, no matter what you say or do, you're going to win Alabama. So you have 7 or 8 states that are going to go one way or the other, and those states are, Florida, maybe North Carolina, maybe Pennsylvania, maybe Ohio, maybe Michigan, maybe Iowa, maybe Wisconsin, maybe Missouri. Every other state is pretty predictable. And so in those states that I just mentioned, Trump has a fair amount of popularity. And he could lose the popular vote by 5 million votes and still get elected under our system. But, and people criticize Donald Trump, but by the standards of some other countries, he actually looks pretty good, right? Some other countries have some leaders that are, maybe different as well.
Agreed.
I won't mention any countries, but...
It's getting in the new normal. Do you think that the if a potential China deal can help Trump in the swing states? Like suddenly China buy a lot of orange juice?
If you get a deal with China, that will help in the swing states because it takes remember, in the farm areas, they are not selling things to China pretty much up until recently. Well, we're subsidizing that. We're putting a lot of money out of the U.S. government budget to subsidize the farmers. But the problem with subsidies is, one, it costs a lot, but secondly, you lose customers. The government can say, all right, I'm going to give you the money you would have made if you sold to China, but the China customer is going to go get their products from somebody else, and so when you're ready to sell to them, and they already say, I've got another supplier. So it's hurting in the farm areas, and so President Trump clearly recognizes this is his number one priority, other than security-related things, is to get the China deal done. And I'm fairly certain that he will get a deal done by the end of the year. And I think the Chinese would like a deal. The Chinese don't want to be in a perpetual trade war with the United States. It's not helping their economy either. And I think they recognize that. And I think they probably would like to see him reelected. That'd be my guess.
Yeah, good. David, changing topics again, you are also very well known for your philanthropic efforts. And recently, you also made this speech about patriotic philanthropy.
Right.
And how do you feel about that? And what it means for all of us here?
What I've been saying is that philanthropy is an ancient Greek word that means loving humanity. It doesn't mean rich people writing checks. And you can do good things for other people with your time, your energy, ideas, and your time is your most valuable commodity. You can make more money, you can't make more time. And I came from a very poor family and not educated, didn't have any money. When I got to be wealthy by normal human standards, not by Bill Gates standards, but by normal standards, I decided that I could give each of my children $1 billion. I'm not sure that would make them a better person. They might not agree with that. But, when I grew up, and some of you may have the same situation, if you're really going to get something done in life, probably you need to have some ambition. You tend to have that when you're a blue-collar or lower middle-class income family. When you grow up in a very wealthy family, you probably aren't going to have as much ambition. And as you all know, if you're wealthy, raising children when you're wealthy is not easy. And as Jackie Kennedy once famously said, the most important thing you can do in life is raise your children well. And if you mess that up, everything else doesn't matter. Well, that's true. So any of you who are wealthy know if you have children or teenagers or young adults and you grew up in a wealthy family, not easy. So I had it easy in the sense I didn't have any money, so I was ambitious. I thought if I give my money to my children, which is probably not a great thing for them, so give them a good education and let them work very hard, and that might be better for them. So I decided you can then take your money, and what are you going to do with it? Well, you can be buried with it, and like the pharaohs were buried with it in the pyramids, but there's no evidence you really need all that wealth in the afterlife. So if you eliminate that possibility, you can do what most people do with their wealth, is they give it to people upon their death. They put it in their will. But I wasn't sure I'd be in heaven to actually see where the money was being given, so I wanted to actually give it away while I was alive. So I was one of the original signers of the Giving Pledge, and the great pleasure of my life is actually giving away money and doing it for things I think are useful. There's an infinite number of things you could do, but I try to stay involved, and I try to use it as a lesson for my own children. And so yesterday, one of my projects was to rebuild the Washington Monument, make sure it's open, and I climbed to the top of it yesterday. And on Friday, the Washington Monument, after being closed for off and on for about 8 years, is now going to be open. And those are the kind of things that give me some pleasure. So patriotic philanthropy is one of my types of philanthropy. And what it means by patriotic philanthropy is trying to remind people of the history and heritage of our country. So I buy the historic documents like the Magna Carta, the Declaration of Independence, the Emancipation Proclamation, and give them the places where people can see them, or I'll fix up Thomas Jefferson's home, George Washington's home, James Madison's home, the Washington Monument, National Archives, the Kennedy Center, as a way to make those places better, and then more people will go there, and hopefully, ultimately, people will follow my example and do the same thing. So it's what I'm trying to do, and I'm trying to get as much done before I die as I can, and so racing to get stuff done. I call what I'm doing now sprinting to the finish line, because when you're 70, you don't know if you're going to make it to 80 or 90, and every day the first thing I read in the newspapers is the obituaries to see how many people who are younger than me died. And so I said, I better quick, what I'm doing, get going again, and make sure I get stuff done before it's too late.
Yeah, but David, but more important than important to highlight here that more important than the money you have been is donating your talent to all these initiatives that you are heading. So that's what I think is amazing.
So let me just end, if I could, with a final statement about philanthropy, and think about this. In the late 1880s, a man went down from his bedroom to his breakfast table in Stockholm. He opened the newspaper and he read, "Alfred Nobel has died. The inventor of dynamite is gone. Thank God the man who killed so many people is no longer with us." The person who was at the breakfast table reading that obituary was Alfred Nobel. He hadn't died. The newspapers made a mistake. It was his younger brother, Ludwig, who died. But he had the advantage of seeing what his obituary would look like. And he didn't like it. So he said, what can I do to get a better obituary when I do die? So he came up with the Nobel Prizes, and they did have some impact and made his name much better than it would otherwise have been. So all of you, if tomorrow you could read your own obituary, would you be happy with it? And if you would, congratulations. If you think that there's something you would like to have written about yourself for your time on Earth that you haven't done, I encourage you to try to think about doing it, and doing it now, because you can always put things off, but it's better to get things done sooner rather than later. And then ultimately, you want to have an obituary that your children, your spouse, your parents, whoever it might be that you're close to, is proud of and that you're proud of. And so one of the things I tell people to do is try to give back to your country. Your country is someplace that you live and where you have some obligations, and try to find something you can do to make your country a slightly better place. And I have there's an advantage in doing this if you're rolling your eyes. Number one, people who do this live longer. So if you want to live longer, do this. And the reason I say that is people who give back to their country are happy. Happy people live longer. Grumpy people don't live as long. And in addition, I'm convinced that for people that give back to their country, there is a place reserved in heaven for you. Now, you might laugh about that or smile, but why would you want to take a chance that I'm wrong? So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. Excellent conversation.